Hello, all, and thank you for joining us. We'll kick things off in just a moment after everybody arrives. All right, good afternoon, and welcome to our MPF webinar, Lichens in the Tallgrass Biome, the next webinar in our 2025 series. Today, we're joined by Douglas Ladd, a conservation biologist and plant ecologist who draws insights for us today from his more than 40 years of work. My name is Amanda Lance Bramrup, and I am the Events and Communications Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation and our 25-year-old Grow Native program. This webinar begins with a presentation from Doug, followed by a Q&A session facilitated by Lily Germeroth, MPF's Conservation Program Associate. Throughout the next hour, we invite listeners to please type your questions for Doug into the Q&A section of your screen, which you will find on the bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. We'll wrap everything up near the top of the hour. Before we continue, I do want to note a bit more background about Doug that makes him uniquely qualified to lecture on today's topic. He served as Conservation Director for the Nature Conservancy Missouri program for 32 years, where he had an emphasis on vegetation, floristics, ecological restoration, fire ecology, and, you guessed it, lichens. There's much more to learn about Doug on our event website, which we'll link to in our follow-up tomorrow. Now, without further ado, I will turn things over to Doug.
Thank you, Amanda. Welcome, everybody. It's always a little awkward staring at a screen and assuming there's people out there, but I'll assume there's people out there. Thank you for tuning in on a cold day. I hope this isn't a lecture, but more of a conversation about lichens. They're some of the most unusual organisms we deal with, and what I'd like to do today is go through a little bit of background about lichens, how they function and how they're built, and then talk a little bit about lichens in the grassland biome. And then we'll, as Amanda said, we'll open it up to questions. Um, I think most people have a sense of what a lichen is, at least vaguely, and some of the more charismatic lichens, some of them are either colorful or well-known lichens, few as they are many people are familiar with the British soldiers lichen with its red caps, or the bright orange lichens you sometimes see on rocks, or the gray kind of blotches you see on trees and rocks as you hike through grasslands or open woodlands throughout the Midwestern United States. Interesting things that most people just relegate to the background. But when you start looking at a finer scale, you realize that these organisms are responsible for a disproportionate amount of the subtle color variation we see in our landscape. And they're also fascinating because we know relatively little about them still, and they're so unique among the organisms that make up our incredibly intricate and wonderful natural systems upon which we as human beings depend for our quality of life. They've been known to humans for a long time. Early Greeks and Romans wrote about them, as did some early Iranian scientists in the Middle East. More than 1,000 years ago in some cases. The word derives from a Greek origin, which has similar Roman roots, which means to lick, because it was thought at the time that they literally licked moisture from the rocks. And I've often advocated that lichens would get a lot more attention and charisma if we adopted the Rolling Stones logo to promote them. But really, it's an interesting thing because it's as some people have said, when fungi discovered agriculture, as most of you probably know, a lichen is a union between an algae typically and a fungus. And the amazing thing is that the organism that results is unlike either parent and behaves as an individual organism in its own right. So they come in many shapes and forms and colors and ecological patterns, ranging from things like the common reindeer lichen on the left in this image, or some of the common foliose lichens on the right you see, totally different, but structurally and physiologically, they have commonalities that are unknown anywhere else in the biological kingdoms on Earth. The fungi typically have long thread-like tissues called hyphae that make up, when you look at a mushroom or most other fungi, they consist either of masses of hyphae or have been derived from hyphae in one way or another. And fungi are actually more closely related to animals than plants, um, and are incapable of making their own food. So they have to secure their nutrients from other sources, just as we humans have to do. On the other hand, algae usually contain chlorophyll of one form or another and are capable of utilizing sunlight to fix carbon dioxide and water into sugars that form the basis of energy chains and structural tissues on life. So you have a food making organism in the form of an algae and a structural providing organism in the terms of the fungus that unite and, as I said, form a shape and function that's unlike either parent. And some of the algae we see in lichens also are capable of living independently and free. If you get in a real humid woodland or something, you may see little tufts of orange fuzz. Or if you see a tree base in a park or something, it's covered with a kind of a green filmy coating. Those are free living terrestrial algae. Many algae are aquatic organisms, but not all of them are. And then a few lichens have a fungus and a cyanobacteria instead of an algae. And the cyanobacteria, which used to be called blue-green algae back in the dark ages when I went to school, um, is an organism that uses different types of chlorophyll, but is also capable of utilizing the energy from sunlight to make food. The thing about cyanobacteria is they also are capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen that's available as a nutrient for plants or fungi. So they provide a double whammy. So lichen is typically thought of as a combination of a fungus and either an algae or a cyanobacteria, and sometimes both an algae and a cyanobacteria. Another interesting thing is, with very few exceptions, almost every lichen species has a unique fungus species, but there are relatively few algae and cyanobacteria which populate the lichen world, and many of them are capable of living independently as well, which raises some interesting issues. If you look at a lichen at a microscopic scale in one form or another, it's typically the fungus that provides the form and the morphology and the structure and the protection from drying out and herbivory and ultraviolet radiation. And it's an embedded layer of algal cells, the little green discs you see in this image, that do all the photosynthesizing and make all the food for the whole organism. So as you might imagine, they tend to grow relatively slowly because there's a smaller photosynthetic component than is typical with higher level plants or mosses or liverworts or other species like that. Um, but the interesting thing, again, relatively few species of algae, still hundreds or more, populate the lichen world, but almost every lichen has a unique fungus species. And if you look even closer at a scanning electron microscopy scale, here's an algal cell with the fungal hyphae enveloping it. And still an ongoing debate as to whether a lichen symbiosis is a mutualism where both partners benefit, or whether it's a very weak parasitism of the algae by the fungi to get food from it. I think it's a little bit of both because the nutritional exchange is almost wholly one-sided in that the algae or cyanobacteria produce either sugars or sugar-related alcohols called polyols that are taken up by the fungus and used for both metabolism and for desiccation resistance and to protect the organism from drying out to the point of being cellularly damaged, which is why lichens can basically shut down in totally dry environments for extended periods of time without any damage, whereas higher level plants aren't capable of doing that. It's also interesting, I think, and may highlight the nutritional parasite side of things, is that the fungi and lichens are capable of reproducing sexually only when they're in a lichen and associated with an algae or a cyanobacteria. But the algae, on the other hand, are incapable of reproducing sexually almost always when they're in the lichen phase and reproduce sexually when they're free living. So interesting conundrum there, although both of them have multiple ways to reproduce non-sexually and just spread vegetatively and spread propagules. One thing I hope you take from today, if nothing else, is that, as I said, lichens are very colorful, but to think about and look at lichens, you have to operate on a scale we're not used to thinking of in terms of human terms. We operate on broad vistas and looking at big things around us on a scale similar to our own. Lichens occur on a much smaller scale, and it takes a conscious effort to scale down and perceive the environment around you at a smaller scale. As you can see here, there's 5 or more species of lichens in this small 2.5 inch so section of a rock. But if you were standing up 6 feet above them as you walked along, it would just be a moderately colorful blur. And you would have to get down on your hands and knees and ideally use a hand lens to see this wonderful diversity at a small scale that just makes the world around us incredibly complex and fascinating. And you can always pick out the lichenologists in a group because even when they're on the mountaintop, what view? You have to look at that small scale to be able to study and see lichens. The other thing about lichens, all of you, if you have an interest, can develop relatively quickly an understanding and the ability to identify in the field most of the common lichens we see. But lichen identification, because they tend to be very small, tends to work at a microscopic level. So detailed analysis to species level of lichens requires compound and dissecting microscopes as well as hand lenses and a fair amount of lab time to be able to work out. But the amateur naturalist in the field or hiking through a prairie or a woodland in the Ozarks or in the Osage Plains of Missouri can quickly identify most of the common lichens and become adept at seeing them in the field. The other thing is lichens produce a series of chemicals, organic, mostly cyclical chemicals, that neither parent produces and often are unique in the biological world. And many lichens are identified because they look very similarly by the presence of these chemicals. So detailed, accurate identification of certain groups of lichens requires a solvent extraction and chromatographic analysis of them. And here's a resulting plate. Each column in this plate is a different lichen specimen. And you can see that they express different chemical components in a repeatable pattern so that you can identify, in many cases, the species by their chemical constituents. Now, what about these fungi that make up lichens? When people think about fungi, they typically think about mushrooms. Basidiomycetes, as the mycologist or fungal specialists call them. There are a very few basidiomycetes, mushroom-related fungi, that form lichen associations. Excuse me. This one is the only one known from Missouri. It's an extremely rare species in Missouri. It's mostly found far north of here. And the only time you can even tell it's a lichen is when these ghostly yellowish white fruiting bodies, about a half-inch tall, pop out of a green, slimy, rotten log. Otherwise, it would just look like green algal scuzz on a wet log. But if you looked under a microscope, you would see that green film is actually a combination of fungal hyphae and algal cells. And when the fungus reproduces sexually, it produces this reproductive bodies. But this is the only mushroom-associated fungi known to produce a lichen relationship in Missouri. There are a few more in North America, but this is our only one. And this is a relatively recent discovery in the state. Almost all lichens throughout the world are a group of fungi called ascomycetes. They're not highly edible or sought after, but they're the most diverse group of fungi in the fungal kingdom. There's about 64,000 species of them described so far, and many more times that remaining unknown and undescribed. About a third of those ascomycete fungi that are known to science form lichen relationships. And almost always when a fungus is a part of a lichen association, the fungus can't exist on its own without the lichen. Unlike the algae, which can live freely often, the fungal component of a lichen has to be in the lichen to survive. And we know from genomic sequencing and evolutionary analysis that pattern of lichenization occurred multiple times in the fossil record. It wasn't like all lichens are derived from a common ancestor, but independently across different fungal groups at different times in the historical fossil record, lichenization occurred where fungi discovered agriculture and became obligately associated with algae to produce that nutritional and functional partnership. So to summarize, what does the fungus get out of it? Fungus gets nutrition and also gets chemicals that allow it to withstand extreme desiccation resistance and dryness and make them able to survive in harsh environments where very few other things can survive. Lichens are found in the driest, most frigid interior valleys of central Antarctica that have any ice-free time on them. What does the algae get out of it? The algae, in return for providing those chemical nutrients and desiccation resistance, gets a home that is protected from herbivory because of the chemicals secreted by the association. It's protected from desiccation, and it's also protected from ultraviolet radiation, which tends to degrade photosynthetic organisms. So it gets protection, and it also enables the algae to survive in much harsher and more widely distributed environments than they would otherwise. It's been very controversial when the first lichens appear because they don't fossilize well, but the thinking was about 400,000 years ago, although many people challenged that. And then just last week, a colleague sent me an article from Scientific American, which finally establishes this as a true thing, and that is an early land organism called Spongiophyton has finally been demonstrably proven from its fossils to be a lichen, or at least a primitive association, obligate association between a fungus and an algae. And this is an early Devonian species, so about 420 million years ago. So the oldest estimates were apparently dead on. And it's thought that these organisms played a major role in producing the first soil-like assemblages on land, which later enabled flowering and more advanced plants to develop. So it all stitches together in a wondrous way there. I did say that every lichen has a unique fungus. As we've developed genomic sequencing techniques, the lichenological world was troubled by the fact that these two species, which had very different names and they had very different ecologies, and as you can see, very different appearances, two species of horsehair lichens from the Pacific Northwest, had the exact identical fungal species. And that sort of caused major consternation in the lichen world because it disrupted our entire concept of lichen speciation. But it turned out from some work that was completed and sort of upended the world of lichenology in 2016, even made the national news. It turns out that the old thinking that lichens were, a happy pairing, as I've mentioned before, and to other people, the grade school axiom that Freddie Fungus married Alice Algae and they lived happily ever after. It's not really that clean and neat. It's often more sorted, involving threesomes of multiple organisms. And in this case, even though the fungus is the same, there's an additional fungus that's also part of this complex association, which differs between the two species. So there's a yeast species, another type of fungus, a microscopic unicellular fungus, which also shapes in ways we don't fully understand the lichen relationship, but produces things that are analogous to totally different species that breed true to each other as a combination or reproduce true to each other as a combination and have different ecologies, as I said. So lichens are more complicated than we think about. And this has caused people to go back and realize that a groundbreaking Italian scientist, Maria Sambo, in the early 1900s, had discovered and talked about the role of bacteria in being characteristic of certain lichens. And she was dismissed by the good old boy network, which tended to rule science at the time and trivialize women's accomplishments. But now her work is coming back into vogue because we realize what we call a lichen is this complicated mix of all these organisms in ways we don't fully understand. And the magic is they behave just like a single unique organism with a discrete and repeating structure and form and physiology and ecology. And they occur in the landscape in repeating patterns. And that is a unique pattern, but I don't want to overemphasize it because symbiotic relationships like that are the rule rather than the exception in nature. We humans have mitochondria in our cells that generate our energy, which are the result of capture 1.5 billion years ago of free living bacteria by one of our ancestral cells. So there's a symbiosis there that is so far evolved, it's become unified into one. Lichens perhaps an earlier stage of that. But almost all living things are the result of symbiotic relationships we're just starting to understand. So it's part of the magic of life on Earth around us. Where do lichens live? On every continent on Earth, because they tend to be relatively small. They tend to grow on various substrates, and we have fancy names for them. Lichens that grow on tree bark are called corticulous lichens. You would be hard pressed to find a tree in anywhere in the state of Missouri that doesn't have at least some lichens on it somewhere. And that's true throughout most of North America, except in the very, very driest environments, perhaps. Sometimes lichens occur only on the wood when the bark has fallen off after the tree has died. And those are called lignicolous lichens because they grow on lignum, or the woody tissue, dried woody tissue of trees. Lichens that grow on rocks are called saxicolous lichens. Some of them also grow on rock-like artificial substances like concrete, which to a lichen looks much like limestone. Um, some lichens grow only on trees, some only grow on rocks. Many lichens that grow on trees grow on a wide variety of trees, but many are restricted to certain groups of trees or sometimes only a single species of tree, which is interesting because the lichen gets nothing from the tree but a place to grow and a moderated moisture regime. So it doesn't get any nutrition from the tree or anything, or minerals or anything like that. It's just a place to attach to where it gets the right combination of light and moisture to survive. And yet some lichens are restricted to specific trees. Some lichens are restricted to specific types of rocks. Some lichens are generalist rock species, and some lichens are very proletariat in their taste, and they grow on both trees and rocks and dead wood. So there's no one rule about lichens, just like flowering plants or insects or any other diverse group of organisms. There are some species that are very finicky and restricted to certain habitats or substrates, and there are some that are wide ranging. And you can find lichens in the heart of the most urban areas of the world, relatively few in number, but they're generalist species that are very tolerant of disturbance and are adapted to those habitats. There are lichens that grow on soil of various forms, ranging from very tiny little disc-like patterns to the large mats of reindeer lichens. If any of you have traveled up north or in dry areas and acid areas of the Ozarks have seen. Some lichens even are restricted to mosses and liverworts. We call those musciculous lichens. In the tropics, we have folicolous lichens. That is, when you have humid evergreen forests where leaves live for multiple years, certain lichens are obligately associated only with these leaves. And is my goal, we've not found any folicolous lichens in Missouri yet, but there are some species of flowering plants in Missouri that have leaves that are evergreen and last multiple years. And my goal is to try to come up with a folicolous lichen at some point in the state of Missouri. As humans have altered the environment around us, lichens have adapted accordingly, and you can find lichens on all kinds of weird artificial substrates where there's a mimicking of the same conditions of light and humidity and temperature cycles that they evolved within and were adapted to. And we could spend an entire webinar talking about just weird worldwide offbeat places for lichens to grow, but I'll just use one example. In the intertidal zones, in the temperate oceans of the Northern Hemisphere, there are lots of barnacles where you have rocky shorelines. And you can see all the black dots on the barnacles here. That's a lichen that is obligate on barnacle shells, and the only place in the world it grows. It's also unusual because most lichens are terrestrial. There are some freshwater lichens. There are very, very few marine lichens, but this is one of them. So you get a sense of the range of expression of the lichen world. And when you're out hiking or walking around, even in a suburban neighborhood or backyard of your house, you take a look at the lichens and you can quickly identify them into one of three basic patterns or life forms of lichens or types of lichens. Foliose lichens are the ones people tend to see the most or notice the most on trees and such. They're kind of leaf-like or flat structures that you could actually take a knife and scrape them from the surface of the substrate where they're growing, and they'd come off intact. And they have an upper and lower surface, different colored typically, but they grow on all substrates. Different species of them do, but they're kind of plate-like or strap-like, and you can see they're not closely attached to their substrate. Foliose lichens often have little root-like structures if you look underneath one, but these are merely attachment points. Unlike true roots, they're not capable of conducting moisture or nutrients or anything at all. They're just mechanical hold-ons. They're called rhizines. Another type of lichens of the three types, in addition to the foliose lichens, are fruticose lichens, and these are shrubby lichens. They have a sort of a three-dimensional pattern. They don't just grow flat on a surface. Reindeer lichens like the upper left here, British soldiers in the lower left, old man's beard on old growth forests in Missouri, but even more in the northern regions. All are examples of fruticose lichens. And the little golden eye lichen in the lower right, which you see sometimes on trees and shrubs and glades, particularly in southwest Missouri, and occasionally on tree rows on prairies, is another example of a fruticose lichen. And the third category of lichens are crustose lichens, which are basically crusts. And you're incapable of getting them off of the substrate because they grow adherent to it and totally attached. They have no well-developed lower surface. So you basically have to chisel the bark or chisel the rock away to get a sample of the lichen. And most of the world's lichens are crustose lichens, but they tend to be the smallest, and with the exception of some of the colorful species here, the least charismatic lichens, so they're the most overlooked. And they're the most difficult to identify as well. And this is where you often have to look at microscopic characteristics and chemical constituents to get an accurate determination. But you could just walk along in the world around you and identify foliose and fruticose and crustose lichens. That all the lichens in the world sort roughly into one of those three categories. One of the mysteries when you have a composite organism is how do they reproduce? Because you have an algae, you have a fungus, and sometimes you have other components as well, and they all have to be a part of that lichen. Most lichen reproduction is probably vegetative reproduction. As you can see here in this photo from a foliose lichen, there's all kinds of little cylindrical-like outgrowths on the top of the thallus there. Those break off and spread around by wind or animal disruption. In each of those contains fungal hyphae and algal cells, and if it lands in the right spot, can germinate and grow into a new lichen. And that vegetative reproduction mechanism is one of many adaptations lichens have to spread reproductively like that. But you see these little discs in the picture here, because it's an ascomycete fungus. That's the sexual reproductive body of the fungal part of the lichen. And in that disc, that brown disc, if you section it and look under a microscope, you would see all kinds of little sacs with with fungal spores in them. In this case, there's 4 spores per sac before they break open. The spores tend to be these brownish elliptical shaped things. That is how lichens reproduce sexually. Those spores have to land in a suitable spot, germinate, and within a very short time, that fungal germinating hyphae has to touch and make contact with a suitable algal cell to start the process over again, or it won't survive. So it's statistically probably a relatively low chance for any individual spore to do that. Well, not probably, it's a microscopically low chance, but there are so many millions and millions of spores produced from a single lichen that some of them are going to get lucky. The algae, as I said, can't reproduce when they're part of the lichen, but free-living algae can reproduce sexually. And algae in a lichen can reproduce vegetatively and clone themselves. So the sexual reproduction of the fungal part and the algal part of a lichen occur independently. But the reproductive bodies, those disc-like bodies, are relatively frequent in the lichen world. And you'll see them even if you just look on upper tree branches in your backyard, you'll see lichens with them. So how do lichens fit in ecologically? Well, they're relatively small components of the biomass of any given ecosystem. And in prairie ecosystems, as we'll find out in a minute, they're even a very more minuscule component of the biota. But they punch above their weight in some ecological aspects because many of them contain cyanobacteria and are capable of fixing nitrogen. And because nitrogen is a limiting environment in many of the habitats on Earth, including areas of Missouri, it is thought that they play a disproportionate role in nitrogen cycling. And if you hike through a woodland in the Ozarks, say, particularly after a windstorm or a windy day, you'll see all kinds of little fallen branches with lichens all over the ground. It has never been measured quantitatively yet. My fantasy that someone will do it, but it'll be an extremely tedious project. But those lichens probably contain a disproportionate amount of the stored nitrogen reservoir in the biosphere in that little landscape there. And they're recycling that nitrogen as they decay once they've fallen from the tree. Lichens are also important wildlife food in some parts of the world. In the Pacific Northwest, the northern flying squirrel relies in winter almost totally on the brown horsehair lichen you see here for its nutrition. And it goes out at night, and it's a major component of its diet. Um, in times of duress, Native American populations would also use this as a food source. I have heard from people who have tried it that it is not tasty, but is better than starving. If you ever see a Parula warbler in this part of the world during breeding season, you know you're in an area that supports old man's beard lichens in the canopy of the trees, the genus Usnea, because Parula warblers can only produce their nest or only make their nest from two things: Spanish moss, which we're too far north for Spanish moss to occur, or old man's beard lichens. And old man's beard lichens are interesting because they're one of the more sensitive indicators of air quality. And polluted air sheds is one of the first lichens to disappear. So if you see nesting Parula warblers or you see them during breeding season, tells you that they're securing nesting material. It endorses both the diversity somewhere nearby of an intact natural habitat, woodland habitat of some type, and is a nod to the quality of the air shed you're in. If you've ever found a ruby-throated hummingbird nest, these microscopic, almost an inch across little beautiful, fine, downlight, cup-shaped nest, they're invariably lined on the outside with pieces of foliose lichen the hummingbird has picked off piece by piece and attached very carefully to the nest to create this effect. If you go in the dry, acid areas of the ridges of the Ozarks or in sparse areas of some MPF prairie lands, you'll see populations of reindeer lichen. And then if you go to the far north, you'll see where it becomes a dominant in the landscape as you move closer and closer to the tundra. These lichens are the primary winter food source for the massive caribou herds, which are such a magnificent spectacle in North America. As far as human uses, lichens fairly limited. Lichens produce some pretty spectacular colored dyes, and particularly historically were used extensively for the dye industry in the old world. There's a type of fabric shown here on the right called Harris tweed, but to be officially Harris tweed, it has to be made from lichen dyes. But with the advent of synthetic chemical dyes, lichens as dye stuffs have become sort of a minor component of the industry. Lichens are used because the chemicals they produce often have antibiotic properties, probably as a protection for the lichen organism itself, but they're used sometimes in antibiotics, toothpaste, deodorants, things like that, particularly in Europe, although you can buy some here as well in North America. And many lichens are at least not toxic to eat. There are some toxic lichens, but most are not toxic, but most are not highly palatable. But one that is considered a delicacy in parts of Asia is a relative of this North American species, the rock tripe lichen, although anything named after tripe doesn't sound like an endorsement of its Epicurean properties to me, but they are eaten occasionally deep fried. You can deep fry pretty much anything and make it taste good, I guess. But again, a minor component of food. And lichens play a role in artwork as well. After you sit through this whole webinar, you're probably going to be so excited you'll run out to your local tattoo emporium before it closes and get a lichen tattoo just to commemorate your newfound appreciation for the unique world of lichens. Much of Missouri, particularly northern and western Missouri, was tallgrass prairie once upon a time. And prairie grasslands and lichens are often fairly incompatible because what shaped and formed the prairies is a dense, diverse, robust association of hundreds of different species of flowering plants that often in the typical fertile prairie soils in the tallgrass region preempt anything growing underneath them. They shade it out and they compete and grow highly. And there's an ongoing presence that formed and maintained our prairies of frequent dormant season fires and grazing and periodic grazing and browsing, particularly by bison and elk once upon a time. All of these tend to be antithetical to establishment of lichens, which tend to be very slow growing, because as we talked about, there's a little bit of the organism making food for a lot of the organism, and they tend to be low. And trampling by livestock tends to rapidly deplete this the stable soil where lichens often take a century or more to become established. And lichens are among the slowest growing organisms we know. In Antarctica, lichens will grow, have been measured growth rates of less than a millimeter in 300 years. So they're just incredibly low there. And even here, most lichens tend to grow much more slowly than other plants that we see. But our prairies and glade environments and other grassland environments in the Midwest here have areas where, because of drought or nutrient limitations or exposed rocks, create great habitats for lichens because competition from vascular plants is minimized. The effects of fire and browsing and grazing are also minimized in these microsites. So there are lichens that are associated with our grasslands here. And as you go further west into the western tallgrass and then the mixed grass and the short grass, you get into progressively more and more lichen diversity in the grasslands. We're right on the edge of it here. Lichenologists tend to be a little bit snobby and tend to turn up their nose at the Midwest and all these nameless square states, and they tend to focus on the coastal areas or the southeastern or far northern areas where there's a lot of lichen diversity. But a colleague of mine, Caleb Morris at University of Kansas, and myself have looked a lot in the western tallgrass, eastern mixed grass, and cross timbers area. And we're finding undescribed new species that no one's paid attention to. So there are lichens in grasslands. This is one of them. It's just a little black dot on rocks. It's not charismatic in any way. But if you look at its distribution, it sort of spans that ecotone in the cross timbers, western tallgrass, eastern shortgrass region, just barely creeping into a single station in the Kansas City area, likely to probably occur in some of the MPF limestone prairies I've not looked at on the far western edge of the state, but it's not been determined. We've not verified that. Unrelated evolutionarily lichen with a very similar distribution is this species here, which is found on acid sandstones in almost the same distribution, although it has never lapped into Missouri. Likely, or I have hopes we'll find it eventually on the western part of the state, maybe down along the sandstone grasslands along the Marmaton River in Vernon County or somewhere like that. Point being, there are lichens associated with grasslands and restricted to grasslands in these cases, or grassland associated habitats like the cross timbers. And the name of this species we named to honor the cross timbers because it's one of the most neglected diverse ecoregions in the Midwest, we felt. But lichens do occur in grasslands. As you go further east into the more fertile and more developed vascular vegetation of the prairie, the eastern tallgrass prairie region into Missouri and beyond, lichens become less common components of those systems, but they're still there. And if you had to pick a poster child lichen prairie for Missouri, among the MPF prairies, it would be Schwartz Prairie in the Osage Plains of southwest Missouri, where there's a lot of surfacing bedrock of sandstone in local areas of that prairie. As you can see from this image, you can see the dark green clumps of mosses and the pale green clumps of lichens, even at a distant shot like this, are major components of these very small microhabitats. This was shortly after a rainstorm, so it looks semi-aquatic, but that's not the case. If you were to look closely here, you would find more than 20 different species of lichens, many of them nearly microscopic, requiring a hand lens, growing on various aspects of the bedrock here. So lichens are a part of the tall grass, but they're sporadically distributed where the vascular vegetation is sufficiently sparse to allow habitats for them to occur. So you get it where there's lots of exposed rock or even a single exposed boulder. You get it where there's very dry, excessively drained soils or nutrient poor soils. The most common lichen on these acid barrens in our glades and prairies is a group of lichens called the rock shield lichens. And common names for lichens are, frankly, pretty contrived, but a few years ago, an effort was made to give them common names to increase their popularity and recognition among the general public. So I've tried to use those names here. But the genus Xanthoparmelia are all these very pale green lichens you see on acid rocks throughout the world, worldwide in both hemispheres, in both the old and the new world. There are hundreds and hundreds of species. There's 16 or so different species here in Missouri. They all look very similar, but the rock shield lichens are a major component of our acid rocks in the Midwest here, and probably by biomass, the singular most prevalent lichen in our acid prairies. And those lichens um, have created strange evolutionary relationships. So if you're hiking in areas where there's a lot of Xanthoparmelia on bedrock in parts of Missouri, you may see the lichen grasshopper, which is a grasshopper colored just fantastically to perfectly resemble the Xanthoparmelia where it sits. And when it lands, you can barely tell it's there. For years, the literature or popular accounts said it ate lichens as well. I was suspicious of that because these Xanthoparmelia lichens have a protective chemical called usnic acid, which is very bitter and unpalatable. Um, and a genetic experiment being done at Washington University resulted in a whole series of specimens, and I convinced them to give me the stomach contents, and we analyzed them chemically. And no, lichen grasshoppers hide on lichens, but they don't eat any lichens. Their diet is almost completely grass, but a wonderful adaptation for camouflage. In the slightly wetter areas in this microhabitat just below the rock shield lichens, the green lichens, is a lichen you would have trouble telling from the rock unless you got down on your hands and knees because it's colored very similarly. This is the sandstone stippleback lichen, relatively recently described from the Midwest based on a Missouri specimen. It was described sometime in the early 2000s, I believe. Common in these exposed massive sandstone flats on glades and prairies in the Ozarks and surrounding ecoregions. And the interesting thing about Schwartz Prairie is that sandstone there is a special kind of sandstone. Most sandstones are old marine sandstones that formed at the bottoms of oceans. But the sandstone at Schwartz Prairie is what's called a channel sandstone. It's a younger Pennsylvanian age sandstone, and it contains a series of metal, heavy metal components, which makes it toxic to a lot of organisms. But this organism here, a relatively unusual lichen, is only found outside of the desert regions of the Southwest on these mineralogically heavy metal containing sandstone. So it's only found in Missouri on the channel sandstones we have. Schwartz Prairie is one of the very few places in the upper Midwest where the species occurs. If you get into limestone or dolomite prairies with a lot of calcium and not so much acidity, you get a whole different set of lichens. And most of them tend to be relatively small and not the big shield lichens that you can pick up from 100 feet away when you're walking. You have to get down on your hands and knees and ideally use a hand lens. This lichen here is one of the most common lichens on calcium-rich rocks, ranging from little pebbles to large boulders or ledges. But all you see is a slightly paler whitening where the thallus grows. And then each of the reproductive bodies, the black discs, the frosted black disc you see here, runs about 1.5 millimeters across at maximum. But it's only found on high calcium substrates, and it requires full exposure to sunlight. So it typically occurs in grasslands and glades where you have either exposed boulders or very sparse vegetation where it can survive. The interesting thing about our prairie lichens is that as we have altered the processes that shaped and maintained our prairies, particularly by changing the fire regimes that the Native Americans had maintained for thousands of years, it has allowed a regrowth of trees and woody vegetation here. And so But even though it's not ideal from a prairie management standpoint, many of our prairies have existing fence rows or tree lines in them or woody thickets. And these have provided a brand new source of different substrates and allowed a whole series of new lichens to come in to our prairie landscape. So if you hike any MPF prairie where there's an adjacent landowner who has a tree fence line or a wood row or something, you're going to find a series of lichens on those trees. One of the most common ones you'll find in the prairie districts is this hoary rosette lichen here. Range that what you see in the picture is about 3 inches wide. Um, Pale whitish gray thallus. It's a foliose lichen, and it loves exposed tree habitats, either branches or trunks that are in almost full sunlight or very light shade. As you get eastward into the Ozarks and the more wooded regions, this species becomes less common, except in artificial areas where many of the trees have been removed and you have a wood row or something. A lichen that thrives in many prairies on dead wood, both hardwood and softwood, but particularly on old dead cedar wood, including fence posts and fence rails, is the fence post lichen. A beautiful orange lichen, very small. Each of the little disc-like or dark orange discs you see here is less than a millimeter across, but it covers large areas. And a lot of the orange color you see if you drive by fence rows on rural roads in grassland and pasture districts is this lichen. You can see the barbed wire at the bottom of the image for scale. There are also some grassland lichens that get fairly close to Missouri from the west, but don't get here. One of them is this yellowish green lichen that occurs on acid soils. So you might expect it if you got lucky on thin soil pockets over sandstone in areas like Schwartz Prairie. I have hopes we can find it at some point in the state, but has not been found in Missouri yet. There is a reward out for whoever finds this lichen. You'll get the ice cream treat of your dreams if you find a record for Missouri. Similarly, on soils in our calcium-rich prairies on dolomite and limestone, there's another soil lichen that conceivably could be found here, but we haven't found it yet. So there's a lot we still don't know about our prairie lichens. And unfortunately, most of our prairies were blitzed before people even thought about looking at the lichens in them. I think I'm optimistic that there are additional discoveries to be found in Missouri's prairie lichen landscapes, but time will tell how that works out. So that's sort of a whirlwind introduction to both lichens and the relationship in our grassland systems. It's just amazing to me that these small little organisms have such a unique combination of function and how they display themselves across the landscape and how they're set up. And I hope next time you go out and you walk anywhere, you look a little bit to see if you can find a lichen in the world around you. And I'd like to conclude with thanks to the organizations and agencies that allowed me to do my work. So thank you very much. And I guess it's time for questions.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was so enjoyable and I learned so much. And we do have a series of questions. So I'll just begin um, heading those out for you. So, first up, we have considerations of the environment on lichens. So, we had a question asker ask as to what the environmental threats are to lichens, or what are maybe challenges to lichens in the environment.
That's a great question. And lichens are perhaps as a class more sensitive and quicker indicators of problems in the environment than other plants because they have such narrow ranges of temperature, humidity, and pollution resistance. So I guess if I was asked what the threats were, what come to mind is air pollution, particularly heavy metal pollution, has caused major problems. And lichens, many lichens are well known to be extremely sensitive to either sulfur or heavy metals and atmospheric deposition and car exhaust and stuff. On the good side of that, we are seeing a rebound of urban lichens since the cessation of leaded gas in the 1990s. So there's the small hopeful thing there, but with the continuing degradation of air quality laws, we worry a lot about continuing degradation of lichens. There are a few lichens that are very tolerant of pollution, but not many. The other issues are climate change because the microclimate of lichens is so critical. Ongoing climate change is seeming to have major impacts to certain lichen populations. And that's probably the number one long-term problem. The number one immediate problem is habitat destruction and degradation. We have to save our existing natural areas and natural vegetation associations long enough that we can figure out how to triage them through climate change. But habitat destruction globally and in Missouri is still happening at an unprecedented rate. And that's the number one problem. So you have climate change, habitat destruction, and atmospheric deposition, air quality issues. Those are the big three in my mind.
Got it. Thank you. Um, we have a question, or I'll ask this question about the lichens that live on the sandstones with the heavy metals, just because you mentioned the metal sensitivity. But we had one person wondering, do lichens take in any of those heavy metals, do you know, or do they recycle anything? Do you know
That's a
anything
great
about that?
question, and I can find out the answer. I do not know that answer, the uptake rate of heavy metal tolerant lichens. There are a series of lichens, both in Europe and here, that have been looked at because they are tolerant of heavy metal deposition, at least to some extent. But I don't know the rate of uptake. I wish I could answer that, but I can't.
No, thank you. If you find it, but it's still interesting to think about what they're taking up for from their environment, or if they are, because the next question is how it is interesting that though the fungi is not taking anything from a tree that it's on or from the rock, we still see this specialization sometimes of those. Could you speak to maybe why lichens attach to specific substrates when they get nothing, quote, from them?
Yeah, and before that, let me add one thing to the channel sandstone. I think current hypotheses are that those heavy metal tolerant lichens are there just because there is reduced competition and they're not highly competitive in normal environments. So by being able to tolerate some level of metal in at least the substrate, not in the air, they're able to find homes where they'd be outcompeted otherwise. Uh, and then the main part of the question again was what? I'm sorry.
The why are they attached to those
Oh, that's right.
substrates specifically?
So that's a great question. And all I can say is we know, and the more we look at it, the more it's reinforced. Many lichens have extremely narrow microhabitat requirements. And it relates to the pH of the substrate, the age of the substrate, the porosity of the substrate, the moisture holding capacity of the substrate, the way it warms or cools under solar radiation. And apparently, in the case of trees, certain tree barks, well, we know their pHs vary from circumneutral to extremely acidic, but certain tree barks provide this unique combination of characters that allow the survival of certain lichens. And as you might imagine, even in, say, take a group like the oaks, there's two major groups of oaks, the red oaks and the white oaks. The white oaks tend to have more flaky, more rapidly scaling bark. They have much lower both diversity and biomass of lichens on their tree trunks than do the red oak group, which has longer persistent bark. But it's a the ecological requirements and footprint for a given species of lichen are such that there's only a very narrow range in many cases of what they can tolerate. And there are not many studies that have worked this out, but we know those are the variables that come into play. And the
Great, thank
same with
you.
rock. Yeah.
And same with rocks. Great,
Yeah.
thank you. Um, More questions, sort of pivoting to back how you mentioned that lichens were used for dyes. That was fascinating. And it had a question asker wondering if do you know of any other human reasons to cultivate lichen, or even do any other animals cultivate lichen? Um, do you know anything about those sorts of purposeful
Well,
cultivations?
I guess cultivate lichens is a difficult term. It's almost impossible to grow lichens. I mean, there have been some transplant studies with endangered species where they very carefully try to mimic conditions. Some of them have had limited success, but one of the issues with lichens being exploited for dyes or other uses is that they're slow growing and they can't be produced commercially, so it hammers native populations. Um, The decorative industry harvests vast amounts of reindeer lichens. If you're a model railroader, your trees are made of chemically treated and dyed reindeer lichens that look kind of like trees and so forth. So cultivation, no, but in terms of uses of lichens beyond dyeing, there are other human uses as well. They relatively small and niche uses. As I said, some foods, some additives to both medicines and cosmetics. The perfume industry uses lichens as some lichen components as stabilizers to stabilize and allow longevity of the scent. As far as the animal world, many animals use lichens as some component of food, ranging from mammals to insects to slugs and other invertebrates. And lichens provide habitat for a lot of invertebrates. There are moths and springtails and microscopic animals called tardigrades, all of which are often obligately associated for certain species with lichens. There are also some lichens that, or some animals that use lichens for camouflage. And there's a true bug, a hemipterum, I believe, that actually munches up and partly chews pieces of lichens into these kind of yicky, powdery fragments and then pastes them all over its back. So it is camouflaged or looks unpalatable or something. That's something called the lichen bug. You see them in late summer on tree trunks sometimes. So there are some examples like that, but they're relatively few and far between, frankly, compared with the rest of the plant world, which is far more diverse and ubiquitous.
Great, thank you. I was hoping, so we'll do maybe 3 or 4 more questions, if that's okay with
Sure.
you. Thank you for your time. Um, we were wondering, you mentioned the chemicals that are produced by lichens, how that's part of their identification and how the lichens produce so many different types of chemicals. Can you speak a little bit more to this and what they're for and how maybe how
Okay.
they produce them? Yeah.
Well, I can't speak how they produce them other than they come out of something biochemically called the shikimic acid pathway, which is all living things have that the metabolic pathway that allows the production of cyclical compounds. Most of these are cyclical or polycyclical compounds, depsides, depsidones, and things like that. As far as their purpose, they serve multiple functions. Many of them are very bitter, and it's thought they discourage herbivory and consumption. Many of them have antifungal properties. And paradoxically, because fungi are a major component of lichens, they're very vulnerable to being parasitized by other fungi. And so many of these chemicals that lichens produce have antifungal properties that prevent them from being taken over by molds and other decaying fungi. Uh, Many of them are probably also antioxidants and protect the algae from ultraviolet oxidation and degradation of the chlorophyll from sunlight. And many of them are highly pigmented. We don't fully understand all the reasons why, but again, I think it is thought they can play a role in mediation of light penetrating the thallus to make it kind of a Goldilocks condition where not too little light, not too much light to degrade it, but just perfect sunlight. But there's a lot still to be learned about lichen chemistry. And interestingly, supporting these hypotheses, many of the lichens, like the one that just happens to be in the picture here, which is common on trees around all the MPF prairies where there's woody vegetation, um, this one, this bright orange occurs when there is a lot of sunlight. If the same species grows up at a just enough light to survive, but not a lot of sunlight, the orange pigment is basically dissipates to this insipid greenish yellow. So the fact that pigment production and intensity is correlated in this case with sunlight exposure tends to lend credence to the photoprotective properties of the pigment.
Thank you. We have some questions here on the early successional processes of lichens, or how, can you speak to like how lichens survive in maybe a dry spot, especially given that algae are they typically need water, and maybe how lichens can help break down rocks into soil are a couple questions we got.
Yeah, there's a complex thing to untangle there. I'll start with the idea that it, often in elementary school or elementary science and ecology courses, you're taught that there's bedrock and then there's primary succession, so-called, where lichens come and start to break the bedrock down into the first elements that can lead to occupation by other things and the creation of soil. Lichens do secrete weak acids, and they probably do play a role in breaking rock down, but also it's been hypothesized, and some studies have tended to support, if you have a rock covered by foliose lichens, that tends to reduce the freeze-thaw cycle and maybe allows the rock to be more intact longer. So there's some controversy or uncertainty which is the prevailing operator in any given rock type. So the role of lichens in succession is not as well worked out as the classical picture would have you think. But they are capable, as your questioners noted, of occupying primary habitats. So as glaciers retreat and bare bedrock form, some of the first things that accrue there are lichens. And that's because even though algae require moisture, the wonder of this union with the fungus is that the fungus is capable, through mechanisms we're only beginning to understand, of maintaining the algae in an intact, suspended state whenever it's dry. And lichens can dry out totally, and they just shut down. There's something called vitrification of the cellular tissues, where they almost go into a glass-like state and they don't get damaged. Flowering plants can't do that. If they run out of water, they die. But lichens can last for years, and then a little bit of water comes and they grow again. And in fact, a lichen very closely related to the one that's on the screen now, again, just by chance, was attached outside the space station for over a year, brought back to Earth, and regenerated. So they're incredibly tough because it's thought that the sugar alcohols that the algae make, something called polyols, play a major role in desiccation protection for both the fungus and the algae. And it's something that very few higher plants have, that vitrification capability. But it's astounding. In Antarctica, there may be only a few days a year where lichens are physiologically active, and they're totally dry and dormant and, for all practical purposes, dead with no detectable metabolism the rest of the time. It's just an amazing feature of the unification of the two organisms.
Wow, that is amazing. We had a question to maybe get us to think about the time scale here, or help calibrate our time scale, thinking of how long would you expect it to take for some kind of lichen to colonize, say, a reconstructed, they said reconstructed prairie, but maybe if you cut the trees down, how would you expect them to move in? What's the speed that lichens work at? Do you know?
That's a great question, and the answer is twofold. One, we don't know in most cases, and when we do know, it's highly variable. So the classic thought is lichens are very slow growing. That tends to be the case from two standpoints. One, the habitat has to be just right before they can become established, and then many of them grow extremely slowly. But there are analogs of weeds, very opportunistic lichens, which can grow relatively quickly. I have a pickup truck that I don't use very much except to get firewood, and it's parked in a lightly shaded environment. And I have 4 and 5 millimeter diameter lichens that have occurred there, growing on the gaskets around the windows in a period of 3 years. So there are some fast growing lichens, but they tend to be the exception. What we don't fully understand is when the substrate becomes suitable for lichens. Take, for instance, a given rock, like, say, sandstone. Sandstone glades and sandstone bluffs and sandstone boulders and intact habitats have all kinds of lichen diversity. But when Missouri Highway Department makes a road cut, those newly exposed sandstones often go decades without significant lichen colonization. And we don't know if it's because a certain amount of weathering is required mechanically to allow the lichens to become established, or if there's a chemical relationship. So the question is wonderful because we don't know fully when a substrate is primed for lichen occupancy. The assumption is that lichen diaspores, fragments and spores and stuff are blowing all over. So that's not a limiting factor for most species. But yet they don't establish on new substrates in predictable ways or at the same rate. And that means we don't fully understand what's going on.
Thank you. That's so fascinating. We had a couple questions on if there are ever invasive lichens, non-native lichens.
Well,
Do
these
we
are
have
great questions. That's something I should have mentioned. I'm glad that that was brought up. That's a great question. So typically, lichenologists and moss people and biologists have had limited ecological understanding, I think. And the assumption is because they have spores, they can blow thousands of miles in the wind. Around the northern hemisphere, the lichens and the mosses had a lot of similarity, and the same name was used. But the more we look, the more we find that similar appearing species in North America and Asia and Europe are actually different species. They may have a common ancestor, but lichens tend to be just like flowering plants, relatively conservative in their habitat. There are a few globally distributed lichens, just like there are flowering plants, but most of the lichens you see when you walk around any Missouri landscape are North American or North American and European species. There are a couple of introduced lichens in North America from the Old World. And there are a couple of North American lichens that have made it into Europe as well. But they're very few and far between. For reasons I, I, I can't address, I haven't really thought about. In Missouri, I don't think we have any non-native North American lichens that we've documented, even though adjacent states have. But we do have lichens in Missouri that probably have come in since settlement from adjacent areas. Particularly, it seems that climate change is facilitating the northward extension of some tree lichens from the Gulf coastal plain upward. So we're seeing a northern encroachment of a few species of particularly foliose lichens from southern environments that were either very rare or unknown from Missouri 20 years ago.
Great, thank you. So two more. This
Okay.
first question is just multiple people asking for resources. How do I get started? And we will include notes in our follow-up email to help maybe put names to these so people don't have to jot them down right now. But could you speak to literature that's been helpful for you in your journey?
Well, I'm totally geeked out. So I use mostly the technical scientific literature, which is both hard to access and tedious to get involved in. But if you're interested in learning more about lichens, there's a book called, I think it's called Lichens of North America by Yale University Press, by Erwin Brodo, put out in 2001. It's a coffee table book, has spectacular photographs of most of the lichen diversity representatives of North America, and has great basic information and some identification information as well. That's a great go-to book. It's a little pricey, but a lot of local town libraries have it as well, and that would be worth acquiring. If you just want to know about lichens as a whole, well, I don't know if we can do a show and tell on camera or not, but there's a book just put out by Princeton University Press called Lichens, A Natural History. It's an introduction to the concept and history of lichens. It won't help you identify lichens, but it goes into much more detail about a lot of the topics I've covered. And you get a great understanding of lichens, and the photographs are stunning. It's just stunning work. And also, I think both of those are listed as resources in the MPF article I wrote in the current issue of the journal, but I can make them available as well. Unfortunately, there's no popular level field guide to lichens of this region. Um, the closest one, I'm trying to think what the best source would be. Um, there's nothing that really covers anything in the lower or central Midwest, unfortunately. There are some good field guides to the northern Great Lakes states, but the overlap is maybe 50, 60% at most. So I have to think about that a little about there's also online, there's some, if you Google lichen identification, there's varying quality things available there. iNaturalist can help. I will say this, it seems to be almost a requirement for iNaturalist that most people posting lichen photos smear their lens with Crisco or something because they're blurry images and they're not very helpful. But there are a few superb lichen photographers who post very accurate identifications from the Midwest on iNaturalist, and those are a good resource to at least confirm if you think you know what something is.
Great, thank you. We'll end with first kind of a part A, a smaller question of just could you speak to the herbarium process for lichens and how lichens are stored? And then maybe you could finish with lichens that you're particularly fond of or that you enjoyed working on, or that maybe you're currently looking at.
Okay, so the herbarium process, another great question. So the whole basis of lichenology, just like with botany, is based on specimens and type specimens. That that's how we maintain a cohesive communication and relevance and consistency across our species concepts. Lichens compared to flowering plants are relatively easy to collect. You basically, well, rock lichens are a pain because you chisel and chisel and chisel, and you have to be sensitive to not leaving hideous rock scars. You have to be careful about where you take your sample and stuff. But otherwise, you collect a sample by either scraping the lichen or chiseling the rock or bark that it's on, and then you dry it as quickly as possible, just in a paper bag. And then sometimes for three-dimensional lichens, because they get crunchy, you wet them and press them in a plant press, and then you just put them in a paper packet with a standard herbarium label on it. So you don't mount them in any way other than maybe sometimes gluing rocks or bark fragments on a card. And then they're stored in herbarium cabinets just like standard herbarium specimens, except they're racked as packets. It's very similar to the way mosses are categorized as well. So herbarium techniques for mosses, liverworts, and lichens tend to be the same. Lichens are extremely vulnerable to getting moldy if they get moist at all or if they stay in a very humid environment. But they're not as subject to being attacked by bugs as flowering plants are. So their humidity control is the major issue you have to worry about when you're storing lichens. But there are lichen specimens from the 1600s that are still used taxonomically. So it's analogous to flowering plant herbaria. And then as far as people often ask me my favorite lichen, and it depends so much on my mood at the moment. But I'm a little bit, I guess I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder because the Midwest and the Farm Belt and stuff are poo-pooed by a lot of lichenologists, and no one's bothered to look here, as I said. And there are immense discoveries to be made here. And we discovered some years ago a lichen growing on limestone outcrops in the Ozarks, and now it extends down towards the Edwards Plateau as well. And it was not one of these inconspicuous little black dots. It was 3 or 4 inch bright orange things found on the upper lips of limestone cliffs where it was sheltered from direct wetting, but it had high light intensity. It was so unusual that we had to name a new genus for it. And because it was bright orange, we named it Phoebus after the Greek god of the sun. Because it grew in areas that didn't get direct runoff because that would have caused mold, we called it hydrophobius, water avoiding. So the common name translates to the mad dog sun lichen. I think that's pretty cool. And we showed the world a little bit that the Midwest is still neglected from a lichen standpoint. And there's a lot to be discovered here. And there's a lot of undescribed species throughout the Midwest still. And as far as what I'm working on now, I've been working poorly, apparently, for the last 30 years trying to figure out the lichens of the Ozark region with colleagues. And my goal ultimately is to produce a treatment of the lichens of the Ozarks, but we're not there yet. And then I've been distracted for the last 4 years working on a project in the Huron Mountain region of northern Michigan along Lake Superior. There's one of the last old growth forests in the Great Lakes there is a privately owned 30,000 acre tract that has never been logged. And for the last 4 years, I've been working towards a lichen inventory and ecological analysis up there. So that's been occupying my life.
Thank you so much, Doug.
Well, thanks everyone for enduring this. Look at lichens. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Doug and Lily. What an incredible presentation and a discussion. Before we end today's call, I have a couple of announcements about upcoming events. We hope that you will join us for our final webinar of 2025 on December 17th at 4 p.m., where we will hear about native cover crops for stormwater management with Chuck Caverly with Missouri Native Stewardship Services. I hope that you can join us. Our webinars for 2026 will have registration opening very soon, so be sure to subscribe to our e-newsletter if you haven't already to get notified in your inbox as soon as that happens. Besides webinars, we also show registration for our in-person events through eNews. Some events with registration open now include a short-eared owl hike at Shawnee Trail Conservation Area on December 17th and a MPF native grassland and woodland management training near Colcamp, Missouri on January 8th through 10th, and a native seed winter sowing workshop in Warrensburg, Missouri on January 15th. Find details, eligibility criteria, and registration for these events and more on our websites under the Events tab. That concludes today's webinar. Everybody have a great night. Bye.